based on a self-evaluation. And basically, they presented 20 white males with a list of statements such as, it is a bad idea for blacks and whites to marry each other, or black people are generally not as smart as white people. And these people were asked to agree or disagree with these statements. Half of these people were presented these statements by a black experimenter, and the other half were presented by a white experimenter. They took an analysis of these results, and they combined it to make a measure of the biased attitudes. As you can see in the graph, the measures of the bias presented to the white experimenter were significantly higher than the measure of bias presented to the black experimenter. And this is just showing that self-evaluations are not an effective way to study bias, because public perception can have way too much of an influence on results. The next way to study bias was an IAT, and an IAT is an implicit associations test. Basically, in an IAT, you're given a word and you're told to immediately categorize it without any hesitation or thought. So this is meant to study an instinctive stereotype, or an implicit thought. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples of an IAT. Please just answer in your heads, don't say anything out loud. In 2002, professors at Harvard wanted to understand the differences in implicit and explicit group attitudes. So they conducted a study where they presented participants with a survey to determine their explicit attitudes, their explicit biases. And these participants right after were given an IAT to determine their implicit attitudes. So in the graph, any value above the x-axis is indicating a preference for white over black, and any value below the x-axis is indicating a preference for black over white. So as you can see, the implicit attitudes for both the black and white people asked indicated a stronger preference for white over black. And just as a side note, is this graph implicitly racist? I mean, all the values for preference for white over black are given a positive value, and all the preferences for black over white are given a negative value. It's just something to think about. Okay, so self-evaluations aren't necessarily going to correlate with IATs, and self-evaluations are not necessarily an effective way to measure because public perception has too much of an influence on our explicit answers. So what now? How can we understand this problem on a deeper, more neurological level? Yes?
Go back to that graph and walk me through it, because I'm not entirely sure I understand exactly what's going on.
Okay, so basically what they did, it was, like in the other study, they did a statistical analysis of the numbers of the agree-disagree statements in the IAT test, and they made it into, like, a preference for white over black.
Yeah.
And so...
But what's implicit versus explicit?
Okay, so the explicit is the answers from the survey and the questionnaire, and the implicit is the IAT answers.
Okay, got it.
Alright, sorry. Okay, so what now? How can we understand this problem on a deeper, more neurological level? So the next way to study biases was an fMRI. And an fMRI is kind of like an MRI, except that it measures blood flow to your brain. So basically, when a region of your brain has more signaling, it's indicated by more oxygenated blood flowing, or bold signaling, blood oxygenated level dependent, but basically you just need to know that increased signaling is correlated with increased blood flow to your brain, and that's what the fMRI measures. Except fMRIs, it measures blood flow. It doesn't necessarily measure direct signaling. So it's not 100% reliable, but it is the newest and most innovative form of measuring. So in studies of racism and biases, 4 main regions of your brain lit up. And the first was the FFA. The FFA is the most obvious in these 4 because it's responsible for facial recognition. What the FFA does is it recognizes facial features and it signals when your brain is trying to process a face. So the next region of the brain is the amygdala. And the amygdala is responsible for fear and anxiety. So when you're feeling scared or anxious, the amygdala is the part of your brain that's being signaled the most. So it makes sense that the amygdala would be studied a lot in race relations, because in so many bad race relations, it's based off of a sense of fear or hostility. And the amygdala is actually the most studied region of the four in any studies of racism. Okay, so the amygdala, fear conditioning, and the FFA, facial recognition, combine to make up the first stage of processing racial stimuli. This combination of the FFA, facial recognition, and the amygdala, fear, produce an anxiety or fear associated with a certain race. Yeah?
So the stimuli for the study, I assume, are pictures of people's faces, yes?
Sorry?
What's the...
Oh, yeah, it's pictures of people's faces.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so these two combine to create an implicit reaction. This is, it produces a fear or anxiety associated with a certain race, and it's this implicit instinctive reaction. So the third region is the ACC, and the ACC is responsible for monitoring conflict in your brain. So when your brain is presented with two conflicting pieces of information, the ACC is what's signaling and processing it. So basically what the ACC would be doing is, if we looked outside right now and we saw a unicorn on the grass, so our brains would be presented with this visual proof of a unicorn standing there, but our brain would also be trying to process this pre-existing knowledge that unicorns don't exist, so they can't really be a unicorn on the fingry grass. So in studies of racism and biases, it's monitoring this conflict between an instinctive stereotype with the pre-existing knowledge and societal goals to not be biased and to not be prejudiced. The last region is the DLPFC, and the DLPFC is responsible for implementing control. It's in charge of executive function. So what it does is it monitors the rest of the regions of the brain. So the ACC, the monitoring conflicting information, and the DLPFC, executive control, combine to create the second stage of processing racial stimuli. What this stage does is it takes the fear and anxiety produced in the first stage and it filters it. It monitors it and it produces an explicit result. So this ties back as in the first study. The first study, there was a difference between those interviewed by the black person and those interviewed by the white person. And so in the results of the people interviewed by the white person, there was less of the second stage involved. It was more indicative of the FFA and amygdala stage, this implicit reaction. And it ties back to the second study too, where they compare the results of an implicit and an explicit study, where the explicit study, the survey, is more indicative of the two stages combined, the product of those two stages, while the IAT, the implicit result, is more of an immediate product of the FFA and amygdala. So it's really important to note that this is a theory of researchers. This isn't by any means completely concrete. But to understand biases on a much deeper level, it's important to look at the mechanism of it. And though this might be primitive, it's not, it's just the beginning of a long process, yeah.
Is this implicit kind of bias, is it specific to race?
Well, because this involves the FFA, it can be tied to it, but it's not necessarily singularly to race. Okay, so the last study I looked at was done much more recently. It was done in 2015 in Switzerland. So it's important to note that in Switzerland, there's a general prejudice and a negative stereotype associated with Balkans. So what these researchers were trying to do was they were trying to see if empathy towards the Balkans could be learned in a short process. So the first stage is the pre-intervention stage. And in this stage, a Swiss person was hooked up to an fMRI, and their brain was being scanned as they watched a Balkan person get shocked. So they then went through the intervention stage. And in this intervention stage, the Swiss person was then being told that they would be administered 20 shocks, but the Balkan person could pay to stop those shocks from happening. And in the experiment, 75% of the time, the Balkan person did pay to stop the shocks. They then went through a post-intervention stage. And in this post-intervention stage, they basically repeated the first stage, in which the Swiss person, their brain was being scanned through an fMRI as they watched the Balkan person get shocked. And they measured the empathy of the Swiss person's brain. Okay, yeah.
And were they measuring empathy?
Yeah.
What's the?
Oh, in the
what's
left
measure?
AI. What do you mean?
I
Sorry.
was just asking, what are they looking at in the brain to measure empathy?
Oh, the left AI. Okay. So, they also looked at the red AI a little bit for like learning too. But the okay. Does anybody have questions on the experiment? Yeah.
Was there any particular reason why they chose Swiss?
Well, it was done in Switzerland. Okay, so these are the results of the study. So the researchers noticed that when looking at the left AI, they looked at the empathy in the brain, and the blue graphs is basically showing that there is a huge difference in the signaling for empathy in your brain from the pre-intervention to the post-intervention. So these researchers concluded that yes, empathy towards the Balkans were learned. However, to be honest, this graph it's pretty bad. It's not super reliable, and the entire paper, honestly, it was a little skeptical. So why would I even bother presenting on this? Why is this important? Well, this is just the first step in a long process. This data might not be totally reliable, but it's the beginning of a long process of understanding subconscious bias on a much deeper level. A lot of our thoughts and feelings, a lot of our actions and thoughts might stem from thoughts and feelings that we're not necessarily are entirely aware exist. So we tend to combat biases on the surface by spreading an idea of being understanding and spreading an idea of equality. But this is by looking at the mechanism of this, we can start to understand the differences between implicit and explicit attitudes, and we can start to look at biases on a much deeper and more neurological level, and therefore we can find more ways to fight it. So I got so much help on this presentation, so I just want to thank everybody involved so much, and thank you so much to Journal Club and you guys for listening, for making conversations like this possible. Thank you.
I have two questions. First, the easy one. What was the title of the book you referenced in your introduction?
It was Native Son, but I chose not to include the title because that book involves a much more complicated analysis,
Sure.
and that was just the
Piece of it.
specific piece of it I was trying to look at.
Okay, just curious.
But I would highly recommend it. It's a great book.
I highly recommend that book. Okay, and then the second one, so, first of all, for people who haven't done an IAT online, I highly recommend it. You might be surprised. But there are IATs on everything, right?
Right, yes.
So, some of the first ones they tested were race and sex and then gender identity and then all these things and even professions, basically everything you can think of, right? So in the brain data you presented, where people have this conflict between what they kind of perceive themselves to be and then this bias that pops up, do you think there'd be similar kinds of data for things like male versus female or nationalities, things like that?
Yeah, actually the paper I referenced was really interesting in that it studied implicit and explicit biases over race, age, gender. It was like a huge span, and so I was actually looking at all the other graphs not associated with race, and it was really interesting about, like, there was even one that was about, like, women in careers, and the implicit and explicit attitudes were completely differentiating. Sorry, I'm not really sure if that was what you were asking. But
Good. Yeah.
okay.
So even if it's not necessarily like the FFA that's lighting up because it's
Right.
something less personal than looking at someone's face, you think there'd probably still be this conflict in the prefrontal lobe
questions?
So I don't know if your papers talked about this at all, but what makes people more empathetic or positively biased towards other people who look like them or who share same features or?
It didn't really go into that. I didn't really study that much on empathy. It was just the one paper that was specifically on empathy. That's a good question. Yeah.
You did see that, remember we saw that one, there's a couple diseases in which the ability to be racist was like, there were people that became unable to be racist.
Yeah. So
What is
well, it was like it was a
So
It was like-
people that can't perceive faces.
No,
Yes.
but it wasn't fully just face, so like, it was a decreased ability and decreased ability led to basically relation. Although the gender bias existed.
just
Mr. Dude, you want to take your own question? Please do.
No, I just, to answer Raquel's question.
Oh.
thanks.
Alright. Are there any? Yeah.
Those first two studies, did they have were they only race relations between black and whites, or did they have other races in the
Yeah, this was just studies between black and white. It was
Do you think
not.
that would have changed anything?
There was no. Sorry.
Do you think that would have changed the outcome?
What would have changed the outcome?
Races?
I mean, it's definitely possible, but I mean, I can't really make that assumption. Yeah.
And those first studies, were they done in Americans, in the US?
Yeah, this was all done in the U.S. except for the last study, right? Except for the Swiss one. Okay. Yes.
Next week, we have Josh Metzger presenting on a more efficient way to destroy DNA that will further biotechnology. So please come out and support him.